In this video, I want to talk about the attacks that are happening inside Russia, and especially the recent drone attack on Moscow. I think it was a significant attack, and it shows something important about Ukraine's strategy for how to win the war. So let's talk about it. This week, Moscow was hit by a large drone attack. According to official Russian sources, 8 drones hit the capital, and they successfully managed to neutralize all of them, either by shooting them down or with electronic countermeasures. But according to other sources, as many as 32 drones may have been involved, and there are also videos on social media that show that some of them apparently did manage to hit their target and cause the real explosion. I don't know what the real number was, but it seems pretty sure that it was bigger than 8. The Russian government blamed Ukraine for the attack and called it an act of terrorism. That's ironic because the Russians have dramatically increased the number of drone attacks on Kiev over the last month, but that's what they say. The Ukrainians, of course, have not taken responsibility for hitting Moscow, so many people started speculating that this was a Russian false flag attack where Russia attacked itself to get some propaganda advantage. Maybe it could serve as a justification for another wave of mobilization or something like that. I don't think it was a false flag event. When there was the drone strike on the Kremlin about a month ago, I made another video where I went through some of the characteristics to look for when trying to figure out if something is a false flag operation. And I just as that time, I don't see any of those characteristics being present here. A false flag operation is an information operation. So it's something you do to get a propaganda advantage. And I feel pretty confident in saying that this drone attack on Moscow was not a Russian information operation because, at least in that case, they totally forgot about the information part of the operation. It has not been a big deal in the Russian media. In just a matter of hours, it disappeared as the top story in the Russian news. Putin came out with an improvised and pretty lame statement where he told people not to worry and gave the impression that everything is under control. And then the case was sort of put into a committee that can investigate it, and quickly painters were rushed to the damaged buildings so they could cover up the damages. So this is not what a large-scale information operation looks like. I think one of the reasons that many people like this idea of a false flag operation is that they can't believe that the Russian air defense can be so bad that a drone can fly all the way from Ukraine to Moscow without being intercepted. But somewhat ironically, it seems to me that many of the people who now say that this was obviously a false flag operation, that they're the same people who also like to make fun of all the examples of military incompetence that we see among the Russians on the front line. So my response to that is no, they really are that bad. Like, the Russian air defense really is not capable of intercepting these drones before they reach Moscow. And that's actually the first reason why it makes sense for Ukraine to make these drone strikes. Like, I will mention 2 reasons in this video, but this is the first one. If Russia wants to improve the air defense of Moscow, then they will have to take that equipment from the front lines in Ukraine. Because Russia does not have like a pool of spare air defense that they can set up. And in practice, we can say that there are 2 things that Russia will need in order to intercept these drones. The first one is ground-based air defense systems. So that's systems like the S-300 or the S-400. And they need to be placed pretty close to Moscow so that they can defend the city. And then they will also need fighter aircraft that can intercept the drones during the transit between the Ukrainian border and the approaches to the city. So this area is so big that it cannot be covered by ground-based systems. So they will need to have a fighter aircraft on constant patrol over Russian territory. And then they will probably also need some airborne early warning aircraft like the A-50 that can discover these drones and guide the fighter aircraft. And all this will put a massive toll on the Russian Air Force that is already struggling just to maintain the current level of operations in Ukraine. So this gives Putin an operational dilemma. Like, does he want to compromise the air defense along the front line in order to protect Moscow? Or is it more important to achieve the military goals in Ukraine? That's a real dilemma, and it is the first reason why it makes sense for Ukraine to attack Moscow. The second reason is that it undermines Putin's power base. It's a humiliation that he can't protect the country's capital, and it undermines the Russian propaganda network. The way the Russian media usually deals with bad news is that they silence it, or at least they drown it in other stories so that it gives the impression that the bad news wasn't significant. But increasingly, the Russian propaganda system is becoming almost a parody of itself. Like, I actually used to watch it quite a bit, but it's getting less and less useful because the propaganda is changing. Like, until recently, the way the Russian propaganda worked was that they would be mostly telling true stories, but they would spin it in different ways. So you could interpret things from that. But more and more, they're just making stuff up. And these drone attacks on Moscow are exposing that. When the Russian media downplay these events, it's almost like watching that Iraqi information minister from the invasion in 2003, that guy that got the nickname Comical Ali because he would be standing there saying, no, there are no Americans here. That's what the Russian state media is beginning to look like. And when the attacks on Moscow are happening in full daylight and there are thousands of Muscovites filming it with their smartphones, then it becomes obvious that the propaganda machine is lying. I think we're still at a point where those Russians who prefer to be politically demobilized, they can still do so. Like, they can still pretend that nothing is happening or that it has nothing to do with them. But if this continues, then it will become harder, especially when there will come a new wave of mobilization, which there will at some point. If Moscow is under constant attacks and it's obvious that Putin is not in control, and if then Ukraine has some success in the counteroffensive on the ground there in Ukraine, and there's a feeling that Russia is also losing the war, then it can be hard to persuade Russian men to join the army and fight for Putin. Right? And what Ukraine is doing right now is that they are creating the sense that there is an alternative to Putin. If we look at the border incursions that we saw recently in Belgorod, then they basically established two groups that might serve as a kind of alternative for Russians that don't want to join Putin's army. So there's the Freedom of Russia Legion, and then there's the Russian Volunteer Corps. And of course, right now, these groups are not strong enough to be a serious threat to Putin, but that might change because if your alternative as a Russian man is to either you can fight, you can be mobilized in Putin's kind of meat grinder in Ukraine, and you can go fight there, or you can join the Freedom of Russia Legion, and then definitely some people might choose the latter. And we are seeing signs that these groups are getting at least some traction around Russia. So for the first time, I would say that we're beginning to see sort of the contours of something that might be an alternative to Putin that can maybe serve as a catalyst for collective action. Finally, I will say that these attacks on Moscow also play on some of the disagreements that there are within the Russian elite and the pro-war community. The drones hit a part of Moscow called Rubyovka, which is the most prestigious part of the city. It might even be the most prestigious part of Russia. This is where all the billionaires live, and Putin also has a personal residence there. So, of course, these billionaires will now demand security. But at the same time, some of the pro-war ultranationalists, they almost cheer now because finally these rich Muscovites also get to feel the consequences of the war. So all in all, the drone attacks on Moscow are increasing the tensions within the Russian system, and they are undermining Putin's power base. His propaganda system is being exposed, and it's very hard for him to do anything about it, because if he wanted it to stop, then he has to improve air defense over Moscow, and that will undermine the war effort in Ukraine. So I think over the coming months, we're going to see more of this. I think it's beginning to look like Ukraine's counteroffensive on the ground in Ukraine will go sort of hand in hand with the effort to bring the war home to the Russians. And they're doing that in a way where they're not only attacking the Russian system from the outside, but they're also creating the conditions for armed resistance against Putin from within. And that might develop into a real problem for Putin if he can't find a way to make it stop. Okay, I will end it here. If you found the video useful, please give it a like. It helps the YouTube algorithm. And also remember that you can subscribe to the channel and you can click the bell icon so you get notifications when I upload new videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.